Hey, welcome to Exchange. Let's talk this Ukraine crisis. Let's do a part two of this. I'm going to start with bad news first and go into good news. Look at overall CPI impacts, sanction impacts, what might happen going forward, and how the actual crisis might be averted potentially next few weeks. But let's dive into it. Hey, first things first. Godspeed everyone on the front lines in Ukraine, both civilian and military on both sides. This is going to be an absolute nightmare, but we're looking at here. It's about 2 hours, 2.5 hours post-invasion. And we're seeing we're getting reports of cruise missile strikes in Kiev, or possibly Air Force attacks from Russian Air Force, attacks in Kharkiv. Also potentially a famous invasion in Odessa, which we're not sure if that's valid or not, if it's actually true it's based on Russian media reports. So again, who knows what's going to happen there. Obviously, we're getting line of contact in the Donbass region. This is expected. This is where the majority of the Russian forces actually are, and they're actually occupying this territory already. So let's going to see what happened there. But at a macro level, you have 200,000 Russian troops based in Russia, the Donbass region, and Belarus combined. So it's enough to seize Ukraine. It's definitely enough forces there to seize the territory. Can they hold the territory? A whole another question. We're not going to know because Ukraine is a massive country, massive population, and the idea that I think what Vladimir Putin fears is if they were to fight back in mass, if it turns to city fighting, street by street, block by block fighting, that can get very ugly very fast. We start hearing news like commentators talk about thousands of casualties, millions of casualties. That's kind of what they're hinting at potentially is a large scale widening of the conflict and or like city by city fighting, which can get pretty bloody. Now, I don't think we're going to see anything like a World War II style tank battles or anything like that. This is going to be a very asymmetric warfare like we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan and the U.S. So it's going to be much more of a, hey, let the Russians invade. They're going to try to draw them in because I think Ukraine knows, conventional style fighting, they can do all right temporarily though, but they don't want to get decisively defeated in the first hours of a potential invasion. So that's what they're fearing. That's why we're not going to see any kind of like massive counterattack with tanks and artillery and everything else too. We're going to see very localized fighting, potentially very like either special forces or potentially small scale engagements. Okay, let's talk sanctions now. So we have early sanctions President Biden and NATO launched over the past few days. Very targeted against Russian political leaders, against their sovereign debt, etc. It was very targeted. It wasn't actually affecting actual European and Russian or American citizens overall. The question is now, hey, now is it ratcheted up? Does it go broader and broader sanctions and potentially a higher scale? And the big question there is this going to involve oil and natural gas sanctions? But the key number to remember right here is 5 million barrels. So roughly to NATO-aligned countries, you have about 45% of exports from Russia are going to NATO-aligned countries, which is 5 million barrels. And if that gets cut off, the question is what's going to happen with the oil markets? Who's going to actually make up that shortfall? But there are some positives there. Oil supply is definitely producing, or it's basically going up over time the past few months. So there's definitely a little bit of supply catching up a little bit to that demand. But we're seeing here, the U.S. will tap their strategic petroleum reserves because I think they absolutely have to. We're at the point now where this is the right, it makes sense overall. This is a big crisis, but we're going to see what happens with that. Now, obviously, oil energy prices are overall huge CPI impacts there. So the way to look at it is every dollar crude goes up is basically 0.1%, roughly 0.1% of CPI increasing. So if oil hits 120, you're going to see a roughly 3% increase in CPI data. And that's the big fear we have right now. It's, hey, even though this is an oil crisis, energy crisis, potentially with sanctions coming on board, what's going to happen with our CPI? And then as it trickles out the rest of the economy, what's going to happen with that? So, 11% CPI, right now we're in a high inflation environment. 11%, that is unheard of. That's like early 80s overall time frame. And that's really get the fears of, hey, an aggressive Fed coming down and just absolutely, knocking the crap out of inflation and with almost like a sledgehammer, which is the problem right now is this is all supply side inflation, supply side dynamics. You can't just regulate your way or, basically federal fund rate or basically raise your rates away, the inflation away. It's just not going to happen. It's not that kind of inflation overall. And the question is, what they got to be very careful about is they come in too hard, too fast. And I think President Biden and Jerome Powell both know this. They can't come in too hard right now and too fast. Otherwise, we could be in a recession by next month. That's how dangerous the situation is. But again, that's the downside risk. I don't think that's going to happen. I think oil will increase, but hopefully we'll hit that 120 mark. If we do, it's going to be pretty bad. Second downside risk is if President Putin invades the entire country of Ukraine, potentially from there, it's, hey, what's the next step? Is it Romania? Is it Poland? Is it start claiming off, annexation of other smaller territories around Europe? That's the big fear right there. So, hey, so that was all the bad news. Looks the actual good news at this. So, looking at this is a, obviously a huge regional conflict. It's growing in size, but ideally it's going to stop sometime soon. The scope's going to be determined, whether it's a full-scale invasion of Ukraine or it's a small-scale invasion of Donbass region. But either way, in the next 2, 3, 4 weeks, we're going to know for sure. It's going to happen one way or the other. We're going to know that. But looking at overall equities, right now, it's like investor fear is sky high. Inflation fears are sky high. it's like compounding fears on top of each other. But it's one of those points, though. Look at the actual cash flows of companies. I mean, they're not being affected that much, even by the inflation. They're passing it to consumers. We're seeing it right now. It's not changing demand all that much. So cash flow should maintain a pretty healthy level. So, I mean, if you have cash on the side as an investor, you might want to buy this dip, because this is one of those things where it's, hey, coming out of the Omicron variant, that kind of that post-COVID bounce we saw, even post-Delta variant too. I mean, this might be that time where, hey, all of a sudden it's, it's bearish and bearish and bearish. The market's always red right now, but coming March or even April timeframe, we're going to have a lot more certainty going forward. So this might be that dip where you look back on it and buy and be like, hey, there might be some great trades here, because the valuations are all depressed and compressed just by overall fear and overall uncertainty in the news and the media. Hey, one sec. Hit that like button. Also subscribe to like the content overall of the channel. Definitely have a comment or two. And I also saying prayers for everyone in Ukraine right now. It's going to be a rough period these next few weeks, but hopefully it's resolved soon.